Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Polity's podcast, The Politics of Tyranny, where we discuss how bullies operate and what to do to trip them in the hall.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
And actually, we're doing more of a focus on the tripping today and less on the operating of the big bad tyrants, because we want to talk about rebellion.
Yeah.
So up to now, what we've really been trying to do, and hopefully this is all old hat to you guys at this point, but trying to talk about the different mechanisms of tyranny. Tyranny is something very simple. It's rule for private gain, and it can happen at any level of power, right? Wherever there's power, there's a possibility of tyranny. There's a possibility of someone taking that power and saying, I'm going to use it for my own ends, whatever those will be, over and against the ends of those below me, over whom I wield power.
That's right. Yeah. So any amount of power, even if it's the measly kind of power of an older brother over his little brother, or even of like your purchasing power in the marketplace or something like that, is a potential place of tyranny on some scale.
And it seems to me a better and a more just society would be full of people that when they feel that kind of injustice would say, tyrant.
Right.
You freaking tyrant, to like the
So
parking
a just
lot
society is
or
one
something.
in which tyranny is exposed, recognized for what it is, exposed and done away with.
Which doesn't happen unless power is recognized for what it is and exposed and pointed out as really being there, right? So we live in a world that hides tyranny precisely to the extent that it hides power, right? We don't know who our tyrants are, but we don't know who our tyrants are, but we also don't know who wields power over us, or when we do, it's not clear what responsibilities come with that.
Right, because one of the
power,
things in this whole conversation of tyranny is that you and I, in this conversation, have been very unconcerned with what I think technically would be called de jure, right, or sort of formal systems, formal offices, formal. What we're interested in is de facto power. Right. So the reality of power, because the reality of power is what affects society, affects the world. And so the reality of power is what we want to talk about. Now there is you can then back from that into sort of social structures and customary arrangements, legal codes, all of that sort of stuff is interesting and a part of any discussion of how society works. But the question of tyranny itself as a moral question is always a question of de facto power.
Right, absolutely.
Right? Who in fact has it.
Now it seems that when we unveil, that sounds a little dramatic, when we do our very best to sort of talk about this is what a tyranny looks like, it's inevitable that we recognize, as we've said from the beginning, that we are living under a tyranny. This should become, on the one hand, alarming, and on the one hand, less alarming, because it is alarming to live under a tyranny that is to be ruled by those who are only ruling you for the sake of private gain. But on the other hand, if you take what we're saying to be true, which is that tyranny happens at every level of society, that every power relation is the possibility for tyranny, just as it's the possibility for sanctity, then it's not it's not exactly that surprising that we live under a tyranny. Like, it's not that it has to come with trumpets and fanfare and someone invades from the north and
exactly. It's something that grows up within us. You know, that one of the things to think about is that tyrannical societies that I think emerge from within the society, so a tyrannical order that emerges within it, as opposed to being invaded. Okay, so let's set the whole invasion scenario aside, but emerges from within. One of the things that I think throughout this podcast series we've talked about is that the tyrannical power can only be established really through the establishment of tyrannical powers up and down the social hierarchy.
Totally.
Right. So it has to, it can only realize its power by disordering society beneath it. And so the tyranny emerges out of a tyrannical society. And this is the heart of, I think, when St. Thomas Aquinas and others just throughout the whole sort of tradition, when they say things like tyranny is a punishment for your sins, right? I mean, it's objectively true, right? That sociologically true. Like, you deserve the tyrant you get, right? To a certain extent, because you can only get him if you deserve him. Right, absolutely. Like tyranny doesn't work otherwise.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. Otherwise, it's recognized as unjust power and done away with.
Right. I mean, one of the ways that you could just describe a just society is one in which whenever anyone tries to be the tyrant, he gets killed really fast.
Yeah. Yeah,
Or
right.
at least coerced into non-entity.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about this the other day because I was thinking about how our little tyrannies become big tyrannies, right? How our propensity for gossip and chatter and idle language, a lack of restraint when it comes to the tongue, that this is the means by which one of the obvious mechanisms of tyranny, which is just straight up spying on us, is made possible, right? Like we talk all the time about how we have no privacy, and how this is, this feels tyrannical. Everyone's mad about this. People on the left are mad. People on the right, where our data is being taken and sold to corporations. It's being looked at by the FBI. Da da da. Meanwhile, we are literally typing out everything we think online. And it's just it's one of these really obvious ways where you can see that the tyranny at the top, which is real, right, isn't accidentally related to the vice on the bottom.
Sure. Yeah.
The fact that it needs it to survive.
Think about the sort of tyranny that's possible in the economic regime, right? And the sort of self-interested, the wielding of power for private gain that's possible at the top, but is only possible because up and down the entire system, everybody's desperate for private gain.
Totally.
It's a total scramble for as much money as possible, which enables the people at the top to build the regimes of really tyrannical power that they build. If there wasn't that desperate pursuit of wealth, it wouldn't work.
Right.
So it's the same sort of thing, though.
And this leads to one of the when we ask the question of when and how do we rebel against tyranny.
It's a complicated question.
It becomes complicated, but for this very reason, because I get it, right? Like you can't keep talking about tyranny and then saying that we live in a tyranny without the question arising, idly maybe, that, well, what ought we do? And I should, to be clear, I want to validate this because no one should hear about tyranny in this kind of neutral way. It is not the subject of political philosophy in some kind of abstract, like, yeah, this is the monarchy.
It's an act of violence.
Yeah.
That is an act of violence against real people,
right?
Like us.
Absolutely. And rebellion is not only a understandable response; it's obligatory at some level.
I think it is obligatory. Yes.
Right. Like, because and you can see this by making sure that you're remembering we're talking primarily about de facto power, right? That if there is a bully on the playground, it's not simply for the child who has the power to coerce him into not hurting some weaker person. It's not simply a choice, right?
Yeah, it's not just
whether or not to rebel against.
It's not simply that the more powerful boy can stop the bully.
Right.
He must.
He must rebel. The question is always one of whether he is in a position to do it well and properly.
Right.
And that's sort of fundamentally what we want to discuss.
I mean, this is an important point just right off the bat.
Okay.
I want to throw it in there is that morally speaking, and this is something I think Thomas makes clear, and it's just I think is satisfied by common sense. The tyrant himself has no claim on. Let me just put it this way. It's always okay morally to overthrow the tyrant from the perspective of the tyrant. The tyrant has no claim to his tyranny.
Okay.
Right? It's always okay. A tyrant who is oppressing people can be destroyed morally. Right? So the question would be, so he has no like sort of moral claim to his power or to his office, or he's always overthrowable, right? Legitimately. And that's important to just like lay out there, because then any sort of questions that we have are not whether or not the tyrant should be allowed to be the tyrant from some claim he has. It's rather simply the prudential calculus of what overthrowing him looks like, what the consequences of that are.
Yeah.
What is the situation in which we find ourselves in?
Right. Yeah.
Right? These become the questions.
No, rebellion is a moral obligation. The question much more becomes about the speed of it.
Yeah, and I think that I don't know if you were going to go in this route, but maybe like you brought up the bullies on the playground, and I actually think that's really a good way of beginning in a lot of ways, because I mean when I'm with my classes, I normally do a similar scenario, but it's you're walking down the alley and you're approached by a couple guys at night, right? Okay. And they obviously have power over you, right? And they can hurt you physically. And so now the question is, well, do you have to obey them? Right? Do you have to,
like if they tell you to give
like
you,
if they tell you to give them your wallet?
right?
It's right. Are you morally obliged to obey them simply because they have power? Well, of course not, right? In fact, if you can run away, you're justified in doing so. If you could fight back, you're justified in doing so if you think you can. But if you can't, or if that's a bad idea and your wallet's not worth it, you give them the wallet, right? Because that's the prudential thing to do. It's like, fine, these thugs, these tyrants want my wallet. That's not worth risking my life. I'm going to give them the wallet.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Right. But that's not because of any sort of moral obligation I have to give them my wallet.
Right.
I'm being robbed.
Right.
Right. So it's important that we just get that out, because, and maybe I'm hitting a sort of particular hobby horse of mine, because there's very often, especially in Catholic circles, some of this stuff gets clouded with sort of claims of legitimate authority, obedience to the legitimate powers, and all this high sounding moral obligation stuff, none of which applies to tyrants. Right. So when you're talking about tyrants, that's not what we're talking about. I mean, we can talk about some of that later. So I mean, the scenario of some thugs robbing you on the street is a good one, because we can expand it.
Sure. Do so.
So you can say, okay, a mafia, an organized crime syndicate, a crime family that controls a neighborhood, and they may in fact provide, so they're criminals, they're stealing, they're extorting, they're, but they may also provide a certain degree of stability. So you can imagine in like third world countries or in big cities, whatever, there is a certain degree of stability that a mafia can provide. And
well, you don't even have to go that far, man. When I working in Steubenville at all, you'll often run into people who are old enough to remember when the mob had more of a presence here before they moved to Vegas, and they will almost without fail say it was way better when the mob had some control, because at least they took care of their own.
Yeah. Okay. So and they even control crime.
Yeah.
Because they want to have a monopoly on crime, right? So like petty crime that's being operated, other gangs, other people, like they'll enforce it. I mean, there's some good sort of peace that a mafia controlled area can have under the mafia. Right. And so then you're saying, well, they're tyrants, they're criminals, they don't have legitimacy,
and and just to nail in on it, the reason they're tyrants fundamentally is that de facto power they're wielding that is for the sake of their private gain. And
and the only reason why the other goods they might be providing, the only reason why they're doing those things is because it serves their private gain. Totally. Right. So they're not, it's incidental, the fact that it happens to contribute to the common good in certain
nevertheless it does.
But nevertheless it does. So now you say, well, I'm justified in rebelling against this mafia. Of course you are. You're justified in fighting them. But is it a good idea? Right? Is it the right thing to do, morally speaking, from a prudential point of view? And it may very well be no, it's not, because what I'm going, if I get rid of this mafia, what replaces it? Right. Just the neighboring one who's worse, or my own mafia, or
you saw this in Sicily when, I mean, this is, I don't have boots on the ground there, but one of the when there was some anti-mafia, movements in government, one of the things that the actual mafia did there was they just stopped collecting trash, because they had so thoroughly become a part of the city's functioning that like trash collection was done by them. That's awesome. And so it was I mean, granted, I don't mean this to say anything good about them, but it simply shows like the actual prudential question one might have. Right. If one were to take on the mafia in Sicily, one of the things would be like, well, who's going to take out the trash?
Yeah, exactly. No, and these are the sorts of questions when Thomas talks about how careful you have to be about rebellion, because the consequences are unclear, and they could very well be worse. The stability, getting rid of the stability, getting rid of the goods that are provided by the structure. Yeah. These things may actually result in a worse scenario. This is especially the case given what we were saying earlier in the discussion, which is that most tyrannies, if they emerge from within a society, are emerging from within a society that is disordered, right? That it is basically tyrannical down and through, which means that the rebellion that's going to be successfully mounted against the tyrant is most likely a rival tyranny.
Yeah, and I think we should slow down on this point, because it's very important, because whenever you talk about recognizing the tyrant, it can sound like you're coming from this place of great purity and great righteousness. But the argument of tyranny is that it most likely means that the entire society is sinful, is vicious, and because of that, a tyranny is possible. What that means is that any group of guys that you get together to throw out the tyrant are themselves most likely still vicious.
Most likely, yeah.
Right. And so it's not that the difficulty is that in the destruction of a tyrant who's providing for some good, who's providing some order, you can't just get the same kind of person to do it for the same kind of reasons. The only distinguishing thing that angers your rebel being that he's not right now the tyrant.
He's not
himself.
the guy who right now happens to be the tyrant, right? And this is something that historically, of course, happens just over and over again, right?
What do you mean? Oh, like him.
Like the revolutionaries are the worst tyrants,
Right, totally.
right? They overthrow one tyranny, and you know, think, I mean, obviously the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, I mean, just name it,
Yeah.
right? Where a tyranny is overthrown, and the people who overthrew the tyranny become far worse tyrants.
And isn't this just a very dangerous part about a dangerous part of the American psyche on this whole question? Because maybe not the American, maybe it's just a liberal problem, but we have detached ourselves from questions of the good, right? So the ruler is not necessarily to orientate us all towards the good, because we don't really know what the good is, and we certainly don't want to say that it's salvation in Jesus Christ or something like that, because that wouldn't be very liberal of us. So we leave that question nebulous. But at the same time, we're founded on the basis of rebellion. Like, our whole idea is that we rebelled against unjust authorities, and that's who we are. So then rebellion itself becomes this kind of inculcated virtue. Like, I mean, I'm sure you felt this certain mandate to be a rebel. Like,
Everybody's a rebel.
Everyone's a rebel. The Democrats are rebels in relation to the Republicans. The Republicans are rebels in relation to the Democrats, and it goes all the way down. Every teenager is
a rebel.
Is a rebel. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's lame. But it also leads to the likelihood of the scenario you're describing, which is that rebellion cherished for its own sake means that you feel the need to rebel, but the goods that you're pursuing are never brought into question. So what are those goods? Well, generally they're just whatever everyone kind of values. It's just that you want them for you or for a group of people.
or even maybe even worse is the people subject to a tyranny who live in a tyranny can become, there's a particular kind of vice that happens at the bottom. So servility breeds envy and bitterness, hatred, resentment. Right. And that can motivate a rebellion.
Yes, totally.
And it's not quite the same battery of vices as the elite.
Right.
But it has it's just as vicious.
Yeah, totally.
Right. And the tyranny that comes out of that, out of the hatred, the envy, bitterness, could be the worst.
And it seems to me like in America now, we'll get back to the theoretical, but it seems it seems like that's probably the only kind of rebellion that one could hope for, practically speaking, in America. If you were going to say, look, this government is corrupt, the wealthy are corrupt, what would you be able to stir that could mount an opposition to its armies? I mean, I don't think much, but if you could, I don't think it would be motivated by the just society or the vision of a kingdom of peace where Christ reigns. I think it would probably be motivated by the desire to hurt people seen as enemies. And
I mean, this is a very particular question about our current situation, because I think a rebellion, it would be it's a confusing thing. I mean, because are we just talking about against the formal state,
right,
which is just not the actual power structure, right? It's just an aspect of the power structure. The power structure is way more complicated than that. So if you're talking about against the regime as a whole, the only way for something like that to occur is for the regime to split in half. I mean, what I mean is you need at least half the army, right? So I don't, I don't think that happens through some sort of radical switch in mentality. Right? I think it's sort of more likely to be a sort of 3rd century Roman Empire kind of one general replacing the next general type of a situation.
Right.
Every 2 years they overthrow the last one.
But the mentality is very common between
between each one.
What's not questioned is all of the vice.
Yeah, right. Because to overthrow the actual regime would be to overthrow the system as a whole, which means to overthrow not only the political system but the money-making system and all the sort of pleasures and things, desires that we're all sort of desperately trying to fulfill, which is the basis of the tyrannical society to begin with. So, I mean, we're talking, a real revolution is a pretty substantial operation here. I mean,
awesome. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that one must do it. One objection that probably would come up quite early is, and maybe by addressing it, then we can move forward on the practical advice for just rebellion. And that's that there's, with that example you gave of the Mafia, that there's a certain difference that comes with official positions of power. That if the Mafia were, say, elected into office, that it, by virtue of those offices that they fulfill, that something changes in regards to the Christian's obligation to rebel against tyrants.
Yeah.
And where I'm thinking of this is something we've discussed briefly before, and I think it would be worth giving a real thorough look at this, which is Romans 13.
Okay.
Because wherever I find myself at all tempted by certain libertarian twitches, which I think I certainly have.
Yeah, me too. It's okay. If you're going to have twitches, that's probably the direction to go.
I get the book laid down on me, Romans 13, which begins, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Now, I'll just lay out, if I can, like maybe the extreme interpretation of this, right? Which is namely that when we have authorities over us, presidents, governors, policemen, that by virtue of them holding that office of authority, that they are required,
we are obliged
to be obedient to them, and that where they are wrong, we are obliged to still obey, unless there's some grave extreme case, say commanding us to kill someone or something that directly violates.
Sometimes people will say to commit a mortal sin,
right? Yeah,
directly.
Exactly.
Sometimes people will say that. Yeah.
And I think there's a on the face of it, I think you can have that mentality, and then the passage from Romans will kind of speak that to you, because it says things like, "Therefore he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment."
Right.
So how do we go about reconciling the fact that this is our teaching on authority and rebellion and subjection from the Bible?
Right.
But then on the other hand, we're saying that tyranny must be rebelled against.
Yeah.
And that the only question is one of prudence in the doing.
So what I would say, where I would begin, is, I mean, we can do a sort of exegesis of this, which is fine to do, but I do think there's a certain common sense element to just initiate.
Okay, go.
Okay, which is, does that mean Hitler was instituted by God and we need to obey him? Like, let's just talk about Hitler. Okay.
Yeah.
So we need to obey him.
Yes.
So what would that entail? We need to do everything, the entire operation, his entire project, his entire Nazi project, which is nothing but a series of commands, most of which are not in of themselves mortal sins. We need to obey. And then if he just has a little cadre of people who don't care about the mortal sins, he can pull off the Holocaust. Is that what we're being ordered to do? I
can't
think,
speak for.
we just need to, like, right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. So like the fact that somebody, obviously the fact that somebody holds some sort of office.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is I think what someone would say is that you don't obey Hitler, and maybe they'd give a little more room to, like, okay, not just mortal sins, but things that are obviously orientated towards massive mortal sins like the Holocaust.
But then you're opening a whole can of worms right there.
Well, I think
but
you
go
are.
ahead.
But I think they would say something like, "But the his authority, that is to say, his in whatever sense he is a legitimate ruler of the people."
But see,
does
now
come from
you
God.
just dropped the
Yeah, I know,
the
it's
L
hard to
word,
do.
the legitimate word. Because the problem is that if you're reading this
Yeah.
as if all de facto authority, all de facto power
Yeah.
is the authority that he's talking about. So if you read it that way, so the guys who happen to be in power are the ones who have authority, are the ones instituted by God, are the ones I must obey. Then you get into this Hitler problem.
Yeah, totally.
You also get into the Mafia problem. You get into the guy who's more powerful than you in the sidewalk problem, right? Because, well, you start talking about sort of official positions. Well, the Mafia has, they elect each other. They have offices within the Mafia. They have a constitution of sorts that runs them.
And maybe more to the point, if they all got elected into office because of however, they convinced the people that that's who to vote for.
Right. Who cares?
Right.
Or the Genghis Khan or something. Did he have the office of warlord, Mongol warlord? It's like, well, yeah, I think he was like the chief, right? So, I mean, it's just those are things are historically contingent, sort of meaningless in a sort of philosophical sense, words or titles, offices, constitutions. What I don't know where they would come from. I mean, I do know where they come from, but we can talk about that in a bit. But those aren't the thing those can't be the thing that is being talked about here.
Right. That can't be the thing from God.
From God. God doesn't create constitutions. So, I mean, as much as a lot of people on the American right might not like to hear that, God does not write constitutions.
Yeah.
Right there, and he doesn't. Those are historically contingent, human specific. I mean, in their best, historically contingent human specifications of the natural law.
But then it seems like in some ways what you're saying is even more authoritarian than Romans gives out, because it sounds like you're saying that it's not let every person be subject to the official authorities, but just to
any authority,
de facto power.
So I mean, this is a more important read. This would be I think the better way to approach it.
Okay.
Because then you need to now distinguish between power and authority, right? And we need to start. The thing about Romans 13 is that he's actually describing to us what authority looks like. He tells us what it does.
Yeah. So he
he
says, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of him who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good.
Right. That's a definition of
God's
authority.
servant for your good.
So a power that satisfies that description, where that description is describing it, is what we would call a legitimate authority.
Gotcha.
Legitimate authority. So you invoke the word legitimate, right? This is a description of what it means to be legitimate. When you are legitimate, then you need to obey a legitimate authority.
When this
is the situation, he needs to be obeyed.
Yes. Okay.
Right?
Yeah, because there's another way you can read. For there is no authority except from God. That could also be read as all of those de facto relations of power that are evil and not from God.
Aren't from God.
And therefore they are not authorities.
Therefore they're not authorities, right.
And we know this, right? Because we know we would make a distinction between the man who stops you in the alleyway. We would say there's power there, sure, but we wouldn't say there's an authority.
But there's any authority there, because what is the condition here? The condition here is that the power is being deployed for the common good. Right? I mean,
yeah,
that's
you have
the
to become God's servant for the good of others.
And I think that this is the important distinction: is that when we encounter power in society that is ordered to the common good, and this doesn't matter what level of scale. So we talk about society as being ordered in a hierarchy of power or in power structures, and there's people who wield power throughout it, and that power is legitimate. Right, so legitimate is just a way of saying legal, right? And we mean it legal in a metaphysical sense, not in a statutory sense. It's just, right? All these are all the same word. That power is just to the extent that it is being deployed for the common good, which is the essential characteristic of authority,
and which does oblige us to obey.
Right, and that's what authority is. And authority is something that you obey out of obligation, so it's obedience, right, rather than just power, which you might submit to, but you're not obeying it, right?
Totally. And this seems like to go right back to that question of office, because when you interpret this as just meaning whoever holds an office that is associated with rule or that is for the sake of rule is therefore to be obeyed by virtue of holding that office, this seems to blow that out of the water, because it's saying wherever there is rule that is for the sake of the common good, then insofar as that's true, you're obliged to obey it.
Oh yeah, the point is that the call to
office or no office,
the call to obedience in our read here is far more extensive than the sort of divine right absolutist Catholics would want it to be.
Don't you think I am raising my family for the common good. Okay. I rule my children for their sake as members, but also for the sake of the community, which is for the sake of the city, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
You are obligated to obey me within that sphere. Now, what I mean is simple. I mean, you can see this. Like, everyone knows this, right? If you're in my house and maybe you've been drinking too much and you're there too late and it's bedtime, this would never happen. This wouldn't happen.
Probably not.
Actually, it wouldn't happen. There's no way. I'm not joking. That's not sarcasm. Like, you would never do this. Right. And if I tell you to get out, right, you would obey me.
That's right.
And you ought to obey me. You're obliged to obey me.
If I didn't, everyone would know I was wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not because you have a respect for the office, right? Now, of course, you could describe that in official terms, right? You can sort of step back and say, well, the father is this, and he has these sort of constitutional duties for his children, and that means that there's these rights and responsibilities from people relating to him, blah, blah, blah.
And that's actually not wrong.
No, it's not.
But what it is a sort of customary description of de facto realities.
Exactly. And this is what I want to get at, that the reason there are offices is because there is customary expectation of justice from people in power. So what I mean is that what makes an office worthy of respect? Well, ultimately, if you just say, okay, we got an office here and it's going to be called El Presidento, right? And it's an office of power by which I rule this particular table here. And whenever someone does something that offends my weird idiosyncratic aesthetic abilities, I hit them as hard as I can. There's an office.
Right.
All right. It's official, and maybe we even all voted and you guys agreed that there should be El Presidento. So it's, it's ratified.
Yeah. Right.
The point is, the reason that a president or anyone within an official capacity enjoys authority is because there's a customary expectation of that authority working for the common good.
That's right. Yeah, there's trust.
It's a trust, which should be understood in its sort of sense of spanning generations, because you can trust. There's a certain treasure chest of trust built up over the years, that the reason you expect the office is because it is utilized to do good. It is utilized for the common good. And it even concretizes it into this expectation, a social expectation that, well, the police officer will do good. That's what he does.
Yeah, that's right. And we even cut in a customary mode, give power to the offices, right? So we can say we have a way, the way that we order ourselves, the way we try to order de facto power, right, is by having offices that that wield that power de facto as an aspect of the customary sort of inheritance.
Yeah.
But it's important to see that itself is a form of obedience. I mean, what I mean is the reason that the president has the de facto power that he does or doesn't have is because the way in which the society as a whole is customarily obeys him.
Yeah, totally.
Right. So there's a certain, we have, there's many different ways this could be ordered. Obviously, there's sort of tribal systems. There's systems that have elders. There's democratic systems. There's monarchical systems. And the church has just repeatedly say there's no particular form. And this is exactly why, is because these are historically contingent human specifications of justice. And there's any number of ways that human beings can specify justice, but those specifications are always based upon sort of averages. I mean, what I mean is, it's like we devise a structure, a power structure that works most of the time, and because of that, we develop a tolerance for those every once in a while when it fails,
Sure.
we'll forgive it,
Sure.
right? We'll be tolerant of it. We're slow to react because
Yeah.
we trust it overall.
Yeah, right.
Right. And in that sense, these offices do get a certain legitimacy, because if they are in fact a part of a just society and they are ordered towards the common good, it's right for people to be patient with it, right? And not to be rash in overthrowing even an office.
No, this is true again with any relationship of power in which the one with power is seen to be serving the common good, right? That if there is, and it goes back to Aquinas' point that you I mean, well, I don't know if you mentioned this directly, but that you don't rebel where there's the chance of the disturbance of the peace, or where that chance is
exceeds whatever gain, whatever possible improvement you might get.
Right, because you can see how in any relationship, like with a father and their son, you might not, a father might screw up. The fathers do screw up. But the reason that you continue to obey your father is not because he fulfills an office that must be respected regardless of the justice of the father. Right. Because it's precisely the expectation of justice that means the office is powerful in the first place.
That's exactly
right. Rather, because the expectation is for justice, there's patience, there's tolerance of a particular act of injustice as being it's just not the order of the day.
It's not a deal breaker.
But if you read Romans 13 in this sort of, I just think kind of naive way, or whatever you want to insult it with, you end up in this idea that like the father, even as he becomes completely a tyrant in his sin, should be obeyed because he's your father.
Right.
But that's not true.
No, of course it's not.
Like,
there's a time. A time comes when your father must be fought. Right. There's like your dad goes after your mom, and it's okay for you to defend her. Right. And not like that. This is like when that happens. Right. When that line is crossed, it's not just okay. It's you're obliged to rebel.
And we could even express that obligation in terms of that customary expectation of justice from the office. Like if the teenager, whoever, says something like "you're not being a father,"
right,
he would be absolutely right, because it's not, father is not this like ideal category. It is the just act. It is the act of gift, and where it's gone in a habitual way, like this man is disposed to not give to those below him,
and that's the destruction of trust.
That's the destruction of anything like authority. What we mean by the office.
Yeah, so authority is gone.
Right
now, you're just a thug. Right, and the thug doesn't have any claim to my obedience.
That's right.
Right, and that is, I mean, so we need not. I think that all of these prudential discussions aside, all of this, everything that we're talking about here is important, but we need to understand that we need to keep circling back to the obligation to rebellion, right? Because and the obligation. So when we talk about, as soon as you realize you're living in a tyranny and you're living under a tyrant, you have the obligation to rebel, but you also have the obligation to rebel prudentially. Okay, so which may very well mean not raising a militia and trying to overthrow them. It may be trying to undermine the basis of its power. It may mean trying to, subtly, in the places where you have power, attempt to structure the beginnings of some society that will be able to stand up to the tyrant in time. And maybe trying to rewire that customary order that you're in, all of which are acts of rebellion against the tyrant. They're just strategic. Right.
And they're not just strategic like I'm going to wait for the moment in which it's moral. They're strategic in the sense of I'm going to wait for the moment in which it works. And part of it working is that you cannot have a tyranny replaced by a rebellion that's motivated by the same goals as the tyrant. This is what we've discussed.
Things will be worse, yeah.
Things will be much worse. And so it means that for the Christian who's obliged to rebel against tyranny, it kind of happens in slow motion in a way, or it seems like slow motion compared to something like the French Revolution or something. When we think of revolution and rebellion, we have this kind of fiery instant, happening, but it's almost always tends to mean that something bad is happening, because it means that, well, the culture didn't have to change in order to get its rebellion.
Right.
So you have, as history plays out, you have tyrants replacing tyrants.
Right.
But what we need is to develop a society of people who are capable of resisting tyranny, but not on the tyrant's terms. So the reason why ultimately, after generations gain enough power to do so, an army could be raised against a particular American tyranny, is because there's enough people finally that want justice and want to serve the common good and for the common good to be served. And that, to my mind, while not a despairing, it's not despairingly far in the future, it certainly is not a thing you can whip up overnight.
No, and I think that we have historical example in the conversion of the Roman Empire and the overthrow of the Roman Empire that's maybe worth bringing up, because what you see is that at the very bottom, like at the very beginning of rebellion, the very first move is to refuse to be afraid of the punishments and to refuse to be allured, be drawn in by the rewards that the tyrant offers, right? So you don't want his promises. You're not afraid of his punishments.
Okay.
And at that point, you've already committed the decisive act of rebellion. Right. Like the decisive act has occurred. You are in rebellion. And because that's his mechanism of control is punishment and reward. Right. And so you've unilaterally extracted yourself out. He just has no power over you at that point.
Right.
So at that point, what we're talking about here is martyrdom, obviously, because if you're not afraid to go all the way, right, to go all the way to the tyrant killing you, then his power over you vanishes, right? So at that point, you are deciding on your own volition what you are going to do or not going to do prudentially within his regime, right? Because you've already decided that you'd be willing to go all the way. And even though you have no de facto power, very, very small de facto power, wherever you have that power, you're in open rebellion.
Right.
This is the reason why tyrants like in Rome martyred the martyrs, like went after them and killed them, because they knew they were in open rebellion. It was obvious that they were. I mean, they even say things like this, like, well, I don't know what these people believe. It's weird, but we're really executing them because they don't obey us.
Yeah.
Right. Their obstinance is reason enough to execute them. Right. Like they, And so I think that that decisive act, it can occur from the very beginning. But what happens, I think, is that the move, and I think we talked about this maybe in an earlier podcast I did, that is also the foundational act of the establishment of an alternative society that's not just a rival tyranny, because what it is the establishment of a grouping of people who are not ordered by fear, right? And so you've overcome fear, and now you're going to be ordered based on peace or based on love of some sort. And so the society that is willing to suffer, right? Like the society that is willing to suffer is precisely the society that offers an alternative basis of order, right? Because those are the same thing. Those are two ways of talking about the same phenomenon. And so that's the kernel, that's the beginning, right? And that's the beginning that then draws society, the people who are observing both the society of peace and then the martyrdom that flows out of it. I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be spectacular martyrdom being thrown to the lions. It may just be the willingness to lose your job, the willingness for your kids not to get into a nice school, whatever. I mean, just any sort of punishments, the willingness to suffer those punishments, and the lack of interest in the rewards that the tyrant offers attracts the anxious and fearful and upset populations. And that society grows. As that society grows, that's a society, like I've already said, that the tyrant has no power over. He can't. None of his mechanisms work. Right. So all he can do is try to stamp it out and try to kill as many of them as he can. But that normally seems to be the case, is that just spins it up. Right.
Because every martyr is evidence of
the reality of love. Well, that it's real.
But also evidence that there are people that don't fear the punishments and don't desire the rewards. And are willing to die for it. So they prove it.
They prove it, right?
You never quite know until someone dies for it.
You prove it, right? That's right. And that's very attractive to people. But I think that builds then the basis for a resistance.
Well, like
right?
de facto power. I mean, you're
It
getting
builds
bigger.
de facto power. You're getting bigger. You're
Yeah.
becoming more powerful. You start capturing offices. You
Mhm.
start right and this is what happens in the Roman Empire.
Well, and it's again, it's frustrating because there's like a narrative that would argue that this just didn't happen, which is I find it very frustrating. It's like Constantine sort of comes in and converts the Roman Empire as if it was as if there was nothing being built,
right.
as if there's no de facto power being built. And the problem with this argument is actually because it makes Christianity this kind of weird thing that's only really ratified when it's taken up into the tyrannical form. It's like, and this is why I think a lot of Protestants have this argument against Catholicism as a sort of Constantinian, how would you say that?
Yeah.
Religion.
Right.
But what I mean to say is, like, while obviously that has its effect, it's not the case that Christian civilization was not being built from the very beginning. That in every, I mean, where two or more are gathered in Christ's name, you actually have increasing amounts of material power. Like, you can call on more friends. It grows, right? You're taking new commands from bishops and priests as opposed to the pagan structures.
Mhm.
You have land that is beginning to be owned in common or is just accessible to the community. So, and you have different structures that just don't even map on to the pagan structures of power and command. So you think about like godparents, that there's something new in Christianity.
The whole
as it
thing,
converts the world.
the whole imperial. I mean, there's the whole imperial order.
Yeah,
is different. So when it is Christianized, so the emperor is no longer the emperor.
right.
I mean,
totally.
we still call him an emperor, but he's not the emperor. He's not like Constantine is not Diocletian, and he is not like Diocletian, right? And he's maybe more like Diocletian than Theodosius will be, 80 years later or something, because there's a sort of transition point.
Right.
But by the time you get there, he can be rebuked publicly by St. Ambrose, for behaving like an emperor, for militarily slaughtering people and excommunicated, and he comes and does public penance to the church.
Amazing.
Right? This is not Diocletian.
Seems so what you're arguing, though,
what we're seeing there are real structures of power, social structures of power, de facto power.
Yeah.
Ambrose has real power.
Right.
And those are Christian forms, not tyrannical forms.
Yeah, and it's not discontinuous from the state of martyrdom. So it's not like, okay, we're being killed.
No, it's
awful, and then we somehow gain enough power, and now we're doing some new thing.
Right.
Which is, I think, how it tends to be described.
No, that's right, and that's definitely the way a lot of Protestant scholars will articulate the story, because they'll want to say that when Constantine converted, we went from the pure church, the sort of suffering church, pure, to the powerful church, and that was the corruption, right?
But they don't see martyrdom as being powerful from the beginning.
They don't, right? They see it as an entirely passive thing, and they don't see it as an act of rebellion from the very beginning, and that and it's an act of rebellion against crime, against illegitimacy, which means illegal power, unjust power. And that what happens as that rebellion gains steam and it becomes powerful enough, and it eventually builds the structures of power to be the most powerful thing, like the tables are turned.
Yes.
Right? Now it's the big brother on the playground defending his little brother from the bully.
Right.
Right? So now you are always called to martyrdom, but you're not called you're also called to defend the weak against the vicious.
Yeah.
Right. And so the idea that there's some and to sacrifice yourself in doing so, like to be willing to die fighting the bully, right, to defend the little kid, right, and that is now a way. It's an extension of the same act of rebellion that is present in martyrdom, now shifting to where you have more power. Right. So your strategic calculus is shifted to now I must fight.
Totally.
Right, but it's not a different mentality. But I must fight not for private gain. I must fight for the common good.
Rebellion begins with martyrdom, and then when you have enough de facto power, it must become fighting.
That's right.
It must become war.
Yeah, war against
And
evil.
this troubles people because they have a kind of, I don't know if it's pacifist or whatever. I don't really care what it is. It's just wrong. because they want to say that the martyrdom is this passive activity,
Right.
and then somehow rule is this active activity, as if the one who suffers because he can't save the weak from being hurt by bullies is somehow different than the one who destroys the bullies now that he does have the de facto power.
Right.
It's like that's one person. That's
the
one
same
movement.
person. Exactly.
And we know that.
Well, and the tradition does this in a very cool kind of way, right? Where you have the martyrs, the early martyrs described as soldiers.
Oh, totally. They just snatched that whole metaphor.
Yeah, right. And then you have
themselves.
the crusaders described as martyrs. So there's a sort of continuity to the whole thing, right? That like the understanding, the understanding of, say, the crusaders is that they must be fighting for justice. Otherwise, and if they are laying down their life for the common good, that is an act of martyrdom, right? And even though it is also an act of warfare.
Yeah.
And so it's the spiritual warfare and the literal warfare converge is the point in this way of understanding. So what we're getting at here is that resistance to the tyranny the rebellion against the tyranny that will result not in just another tyranny but in a just society is a process that begins with the willingness to suffer and then proceeds to the point at which an armed action does in fact occur. So this is like, that is a totally necessary component and will become obligatory. Like fighting against the tyrant and risking your life to defend the weak against the tyrannical powerful is something that we're called to do in justice.
Totally. I mean, can you imagine how frustrating it would be for someone to hold a pacifist position when they wielded the power necessary to put an end to some kind of criminal violence? Like to say,
I'm not going to stop that guy abusing those children right in front of me because I'm a pacifist.
Right. Totally. And I think also in some ways, because sometimes we think it purely as an individual thing and not as a social reality, which is foolish to begin with. But we think that somehow passivity for oneself is laudable, as if we're rewarded merely for suffering. I mean, this is very good. You don't find a lot of people that believe this. But it's like, no. What is laudable is that you're suffering for the sake of the common good.
Right.
What's laudable is that you're dying for Christ in this church.
Right.
What's not laudable is just that you are adhering to a law of non-resistance. Like there's something impressive about it, right? It takes guts, it takes stoicism, it takes a lot. Mm-hmm. But it's not like you don't merit.
It could actually be an act of injustice.
It could.
Yeah, if you have power and you do not deploy it for the weak, it becomes an act of self-indulgence. I hesitate to say that, but
no, I think that's quite correct. one thing that I think is apparent is that there's a kind of the willingness to die locks the tyrant who opposes the people who are willing to die into a escalation towards an extreme revelation of his tyranny.
That's right.
What I mean is it's very simple. It's like everything we've been saying has been that the tyrant has to hide that he's a tyrant in order for his law to be effective, because we don't like when we recognize that people are just ruling for private gain, right? Mm-hmm. Even in our cynicism, we don't want it. But what happens when a martyr goes all the way to the end and forces the hand of the tyrant to kill him because he has no de facto power, is that the tyrant is revealed as a thug.
That's right.
Right? There's no there's no mistaking. And it's important to point out, like, these people are not dying for crimes. They're not dying for some. And this is where, I mean, Paul says this sometimes, like, be holy so that you'll be beyond reproach. And it's actually very important, right? Because if we are not holy and we're also being killed, then we can always be arguably not really martyrs. Arguably, we're on the hand of some of a just, maybe an overbearing, but still a just kind of punishment. But when we're beyond reproach and we're killed, then precisely to the extent that happens, the so-called official authority is revealed as a lawless criminal.
Right.
And that escalates because now more people see him as a lawless criminal, so more people don't want to follow him. Well, if there's more people that don't want to follow him, then he has to kill more people, and then you can see how it escalates to
It also
the extreme.
reveals his weakness,
Yeah.
which I guess is an aspect of the same thing, because what it reveals is that the false world, the fictitious world that he's built in which he's the god, is actually has holes in it.
Mm.
Right? Like where it's necessary for him to inflict direct violence.
If you're God, why can't you just get the Christians to
what's being
burn the incense?
revealed is that, there's like the substrate world.
Yeah.
There's a world in which the tyrant encounters something that pushes up against him.
Yeah.
Right? And that he doesn't control. And so I think this is something to just remember, is that where a tyrant has to use actual violence is revealing where he has no power.
Totally.
Right?
So,
his power is rooted in the lie, not in the sword. Right?
Yeah, which is like this. So there's a twofold revelation in every martyrdom that the tyrant that kills you is both weak and criminal.
Yeah, that's right.
At some point, if it looks really weak and really criminal, then you take it.
Yeah, that's right.
Destroy it.
And you destroy it and overturn it. And this is why that shift, that shift that you see, again, like say in the Roman Empire, where they're refusing to burn, to sacrifice to the demons, and then they get to the position of power where they then destroy sacrifices to the demons and destroy the temples and destroy that. This is not a shift in their mentality. This is one act of rebellion against the idols. Totally. Right? Obviously. And so what we
I don't even get why that's controversial.
I don't either.
It's like, I know we're not like naming names here. I don't want to, but if you're suffering something, and it's as suffering, your whole reason for your glory is that it's suffering an evil, then when you destroy the evil later, it's not because now you have power to do it. It's not like discontinuous, like, now they're taking material power.
They're intolerant. It's like, intolerant? Do you remember what was happening a generation earlier? Exactly through these idols?
They would not tolerate the worship of idols. They died rather than do it.
Yeah.
So, of course, when you have power, you are not then going to tolerate the worship of idols.
No, of course not. Right.
That's insane to believe otherwise.
I think so, too. And I think that there's a strange... we've mentioned this before, but there's this strange idea sometimes among Christians, I think, that it's like the world... Like, we get to be Christians in this little, like, protected pocket. And then there's like the world that has policemen and armies and stuff like that. But that's not, we don't do those things for Christianity or for God, right? Those are things that are running, of course, according to some other sort of principles. And we get to be sort of pure in our pacifist kind of purity in our private life, right? And it's like, I really think that's an incoherent position. So I really think that what you have basically two positions in front of us. One of them is that there ought not to be armies, and that there's no justification for armies, there's no justification for police forces, and that is a pure pacifist position at that point, and that you need to just suffer the de facto power of those who will build armies and build police forces against you. Okay, I think that is coherent, though misguided. Or the other one is to say the armies would be better if they were fighting for Christ. The police would be the perfect police force if they were ordered towards justice, which means to the final end of God, to God, right? So like this weird idea that you would not want the coercive structures of society to be ordered to the ultimate end or towards truth is, I think, a lack of nerve on Christians, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Right? It's like they won't quite square up to the implications of what they believe to be true.
Yeah.
Something like that. But I don't think we should do that. I think we should square up to it.
Yeah, no. It seems like you either abolish the police or
you sanctify it.
You sanctify them entirely.
Yeah.
But you don't, if anything in between is hypocrisy.
Totally. I think that's totally right. I think that's
We'll
right.
let these guys muddy their hands with
But
coercion.
not us, because we're the Christians and we don't do that, right? And I think...
Oh, but now I'm mad at my neighbor, I'm calling the cops.
But as soon as you do that, you can see how the entire burden of rule now shifts to how do you deal with the criminal? How do you deal with the bully? How do I use power? How do I use violence for the common good instead of against it? How do I protect it from being used to being, sliding into tyranny? Right? These things become very complicated and very
Right,
difficult
but
social problems.
But that has been from the beginning what at least Aquinas has been encouraging us to realize, that the tyranny always must be rebelled against. The question is one of prudence. And as you have more and more power, you have more and more questions that prudence needs to come to bear.
Right.
It's
That's right.
pretty easy when you have no power. It's like,
Well,
should I do anything? Can't.
The one thing I know I won't do is burn incense to the god.
Yeah, boom.
That's all. That's
Easy
the only
decision.
power I have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But now let's say, okay, you've got a network of families that are all working together, and they have some of their goods taken care of, like they are farming and they're sharing food, and they have the ability to sustain this community with their mutual work. Now you have a lot more questions.
Right. Now the power has to be deployed, in more complicated ways. And as that order gets bigger and gets more powerful, it becomes more complicated, more difficult. Right. But the principle stays the same.
Now, one thing that I want to bring up that I think we can't not sort of do is that we've been speaking in addressing the Romans question. We've been speaking as if the argument was at least sensible, in that there's a lot of officials out there. There's presidents and there's vice presidents and there's sorry, I can't think of any officials, police officers and firemen and such. Judges, yeah. And they do have this. And so there's a certain reasonableness that says, look, these are the authorities. That's what's given by God, is the offices themselves. You owe them all obedience. Okay. I think we've demolished that on its own terms, like that kind of naive question that just hops over the question of justice,
right,
and simply just goes to like servility towards
and
office
really
itself.
has a very superficial understanding of like historical anthropology, like doesn't understand where those offices come from,
like,
how they develop,
why are
historically,
they powerful, why can't I just make an office right now?
I'll name you president, you
Thanks,
name
man.
me vice president, then we'll be in charge.
But I think what's even more, if you wanted to just jump the question entirely, say, okay, sure, but most power in our society has no office associated with it.
That's right.
And most offices, at least to my mind, is very dubious whether they have a lot of power, or if they do have power, it's as players within a kind of larger web. I mean, I was thinking about this book. I forget the title exactly. It was The Rise of Surveillance Capitalism. Great book. And one of the kind of things I don't think the author particularly meant was how little the state had anything to do with what a minor player the state was.
Yeah.
Like you have you have the tech companies, you have the data miners, you've got terrorists, you have the trade of information happening here, and then you have the FBI that's like, please Apple, can we look into this device because they're going to blow up a building. And it's not, I'm not like, I just think that's actually realistic. Like that's a realistic take, is that these are players and most of them don't have any office.
Right. And even I think that's totally right, that the most powerful, the largest structures of power in our society right now are non-governmental, non-state, like official. Now, the reason why that people might challenge that is because the state does this immense amount of stuff. I mean, look at it, the size of the military, the size of the budgets, all of that. But the way I would push back on that is that is an apparatus that's being controlled by non-state actors.
Sure.
Okay, so like that, it's like, the state is doing all that, but the money behind the politicians, the cultural power behind the campaigns, the money, like that's the power. That's at least a significant amount of the power, if not simply the real power.
Sure.
Right. So, so they're controlling the government, is I guess what I'm saying.
It's a useful tool.
Yeah, it's one of the things they use amongst many other things.
And again, this should be absolutely no surprise to a Catholic, because what the popes have been saying again and again, I mean, and the way they've said it is just that civil authorities will be taken over by, they were talking about capitalism, so they're talking about the wealthy or this sort of business elite class. And it's just, they just have an honest recognition of power. It's like, well, it's not a question of like, which offices do you hold, as if those are static and just there,
as if they have the power somehow invested in them. I mean, it's such a weird idea that like, oh, well, we elect the president and here's a list of all the powers of the president. And it's like, well, yeah, but if you elect a president who just does whatever this other guy says, It's like that other guy's the one who has all those powers,
Right,
not
right.
him. Right?
Totally.
And so I want to talk about that guy.
Right.
I'm not interested in the president anymore.
Yeah.
I want to talk about
and to
that.
be clear, this is, and I think people can hear this and be like, oh, so what you want is like everyone to be very obedient to the Constitution. But I think what we're just recognizing the fact, good president or bad president, who you're really electing is a whole network of people that are like, no one is an individual like that. No one can individually hold an office.
Right.
Like it's always going to be a network. It's always going to be a network of friends that you're electing. That's why, even within official capacities, you empty everyone out and you bring your friends in to be the government. And it's like,
but de facto power needs to be recognized.
Yeah.
Because that's where tyranny, in fact, if tyranny is anywhere, that's the only place it can be.
Right.
Is in the de facto power. And I think that the sort of wisdom of the church historically would be that the reason why it's hesitated over sort of liberal constitutional rule is because it thinks de facto power is then obscured, where we've talked about this in a previous podcast, is obscured behind formal structures.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't see who those people are, what interests or what networks in fact have the real power. And that's bad. And what should actually happen is that the sort of offices that grow out that grow within a society should reflect the actual power arrangements.
Right, totally.
So what I mean is, if we say someone like Jeff Bezos and whatever the Twitter guys or whomever, we start thinking that they're the most powerful people around, the way a just society would be ordered would be to start giving them offices. It's like, great, you're the most powerful person around, now you're king.
Yeah.
Like here's a crown.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, this is the kind of thing the popes have done historically. Right?
Really?
Yeah, like to transfer the crown to the most powerful families and things like that. I mean, okay,
I mean, it's just really fascinating, right? Because I think we would see that as like the papacy sort of being power hungry and making decisions to their interest. But what you're saying, I mean, and obviously that could happen, but what you're saying is that the injustice is that there is unrecognized power. Like this family actually exerts power over those below them, not this one. Therefore crown them so that their responsibilities.
Yeah, this is like the transfer from the Merovingians to the Carolingians, right? Yeah. So where you have the de facto power and the de jure power, and the de facto power is not the royal family.
Gotcha.
And then the papacy switches it. And this is the exact justification they give, is that it's not right. It's not just that the people who are actually in power don't have the crown. Mm-hmm. But see, this cuts both ways, right? Because you think, oh, they have so much more power. It's like, no, they don't have more power once they have the crown. They have more responsibility.
Right.
They have more visibility. They have more burden.
Right.
Right. The power, the reason why they have the crown is because they have the power.
Yeah. I mean,
to recognize the power, and so and to demand that the people who have it become authorities, like St. Paul is talking about.
Yes, exactly.
Right? And say, you don't just get to have power, you must be an authority.
Well, and I think this is what, if we can take that point as simply as we can, that we all know that the de facto power is what is being regulated so that it is orientated towards the common good. And then you read Paul again and then try to just insert, not because I think we get confused by our offices because we forget that they're constituted by our trust and their continued justice. But if you just take that out and bring in like Jeff, Bezos instead of like the president or the emperor or in whatever official context in which you already customarily recognize justice flowing from that office and the people that fill it, then it becomes obvious that reading is impossible. If we say, let every person be subject to Jeff Bezos, for there is no power except from God, and those that exist like Jeff Bezos have been instituted by God, therefore he who resists Jeff Bezos resists what God has appointed, and those who resist Jeff Bezos will incur judgment. It's not that Jeff couldn't enter into that position, right? But then he would have to become what Paul talks about, God's servant for your good.
Right.
Insofar as we all recognize that he's not God's servant for our good, well, most people I think recognize it.
Yeah.
We can see why why there's just not there's not really a place within the Christian tradition for this sort of interpretation.
Yeah, I just don't think in the.
Do you think that most people know that, and we're just like, there's just like,
no,
this isn't actually a big deal?
No, I don't, and I think it's really in the United States, it's clouded by many decades, about actually probably more like 100 and some years of us as Catholics, as immigrants, trying to prove our loyalty and like that we're good citizens. And so you get a lot of this kind of like, you know, loyal to the government and pay your taxes and obey the state. And it's sort of this overcorrection,
Interesting.
you know, because we were always suspicious, it was always dubious whether or not we were good Americans, good, loyal Americans.
Right.
And I think that has kind of a long tail on it.
Gotcha.
I think. And that in the United States, but even that flows out of the 19th century. In the 19th century, you know, you read the papal encyclical tradition from the 19th century, and it can be confusing, right? Because the offices tended to be monarchies, and so you got this sort of a conflation of legitimate authority with who ought to be in power, with who the sort of long-standing traditional authorities were, who are these monarchs. And sometimes the language can come out and come across as if what's being said is everyone should just be obedient to whoever happens to be the king.
Right.
And that's sometimes the way it's read.
Yeah.
You know, I think understandably. I think there's some confusion there.
Yeah. Well, I think we got to wrap it up one way or the other.
Yeah.
But it does seem that we can maybe end on a practical note. People seem to enjoy us ending on practical notes as opposed to other abstractions. It seems like the argument here, just to recap, is that rule for private gain is abhorrent, and we have a duty to resist tyranny, wherever it rears its head. And the question is one of prudence. How will we resist? And in our resistance, will we be successful, or will we be motivated more by our own vanity, trying to be righteous and then ending up destroying the various goods that a tyranny does, in fact, give? Because that's the only way tyranny works, is by establishing some kind of peace, some kind of order. Would we destroy that for the sake of our vanity?
Yeah, and the other side that's also worth emphasizing is it's not only that we're obliged to resist tyranny, but we're also obliged to obey authority.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And that's the flip side. So this isn't just sort of like a call to arms revolution, because part of what the society, part of what makes us capable of replacing the tyrannical society with another one that's not tyrannical is our obedience to authority.
Right.
Power structures are real.
Yep.
There's real hierarchies. That's not bad. That's not wrong.
Yep.
And if they're ordered to the common good, we must obey those people above us. And that's the just order. So it's like those are two sides of the same initiative.
Yeah. And to say that we're prudentially deciding this in some ways is just to say that we are always capable of judging whether, in fact, those above us are still above us by virtue of being just, or whether they have, in fact, corrupted themselves.
Yeah, I think we are. I think we're ultimately capable, because we're human beings and we have a participation in the rationality of God and of the cosmos. But we are humble and careful because we recognize our inferior position, and so you're slow to judge your father. You're slow to judge these people who you are obedient to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the practical point then is, if we do in fact live in a tyranny, as I think we've shown by showing how all the mechanisms of tyranny are essentially present here in our society, though in a diverse way, that we are then obligated to become martyrs. Because that is the kind of through line for all rebellion, that you are not participating in that rule for private gain anymore.
It's a unilateral destruction of their whole structure. Like when John Paul II talks about destroying structures of domination, it's like that. Like you can unilaterally remove one component of that by just saying, not me.
Yeah. and that willingness to die, of course, in all likeliness won't be tested.
Only the people on the edges get actually tested, right? But it's people on the edges that prove that the whole society of Christians is oriented that way.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right.
Yep. And then be real about what you're doing, because what you're not doing is a sort of individual passive resistance, or rather just passivity towards this evil power. you are sowing the seeds of rebellion with the hope of their increase.
Right.
I mean, more people are going to be attracted to the degree that more people are motivated towards the common good and not towards the ends of the tyranny. And as they're attracted, you yourself or your children or your children's children will come at the point where you now have the obligation to fight,
Right.
where before you had the obligation to die. And
Yeah.
this is a continuous movement, and anyone who's willing to die but not fight is missing the point.
I think so.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. That's it.
That makes good sense to me. All right. Thank you very much. Tell you more about tyranny next time.